There is a question almost no one has the courage to ask themselves, not because the answer is complicated, but because the answer is uncomfortable. What if the problem was never money? What if the real issue was never opportunity, luck, connections, or timing? What if the real issue was identity? Pause for a moment and really consider that, because if that is true, then everything changes. Most people believe prosperity is something external. They believe it is something to acquire, something to chase, something to attract. They believe it exists outside of them. But what if prosperity is not something you get? What if it is something you become? Quantum physics presents a concept that challenges our traditional view of reality. Before observation, everything exists as potential. A particle is not fixed. It is not solid. It is not determined. It exists as probability. Multiple possibilities coexist at the same time. Only when observed does one probability collapse into a single outcome. Now, think about your life. Right now, at this exact moment, your life is not a fixed structure. It is not a permanent identity. It is not destiny carved in stone. It is a probability. One among many. There is a version of you that continues struggling financially. There is a version of you that stabilized their income. There is a version of you that built wealth steadily and sustainably. There is even a version of you that experiences financial freedom. These versions are not fantasy. They are potential. The question is not whether they exist. The question is, which one are you collapsing into reality? Because here is the uncomfortable truth. The quantum field does not respond to what you want. It responds to what you are. You can want money. You can desire abundance. You can visualize success every night before you sleep. You can repeat affirmations every morning. You can listen to motivational speeches. But if your identity is still anchored in survival, if your nervous system is calibrated to scarcity, if your decisions are driven by fear of loss, then your reality will reflect that coherence. The field does not respond to words. It responds to patterns. And identity is the deepest pattern you have. Prosperity does not begin in your bank account. It begins in your self-concept. In the invisible narrative you carry about who you are, about what is possible for you, about what you deserve, about how money behaves in your life. Many people say they want wealth, but internally they identify as someone who struggles. They see themselves as someone who must fight for everything. They see themselves as someone who always starts from zero. They see themselves as someone who cannot afford to risk. And so, even when opportunity appears, they hesitate. Even when growth begins, they sabotage. Even when money comes, they unconsciously create a way to lose it. Not because they are incapable, but because their identity has not changed. And identity always seeks coherence. If you see yourself as someone who barely manages, then managing barely feels familiar. If you see yourself as someone who always has enough, then enough becomes your ceiling. If you see yourself as someone who cannot sustain abundance, then abundance becomes temporary, and you return to your baseline. This is not punishment. This is coherence. The field responds to coherence, not to desire, not to hope, not to fantasy. Coherence. And perhaps what has been blocking your wealth is not lack of intelligence, not lack of effort, not lack of opportunity, but attachment. Attachment to a version of yourself that feels familiar, even if that version is limited, even if that version is small, even if that version is afraid. Because the familiar feels safe, even when it is painful. And this is where the invisible shock begins. Because if identity is the root, then changing your life is not about chasing more. It is about becoming different. In quantum physics, the observer influences the outcome. Reality behaves differently when it is observed. Particles act as waves of probability until attention collapses them into a specific state. This idea seems abstract, but when we bring it into the human experience, it becomes deeply personal. Because in life, your identity is the observer. Your identity is the lens through which you interpret reality. And that lens shapes the decisions you make every day. Most people believe they act according to what they want, but that is rarely true. You do not act according to what you want. You act according to what you believe you are. This difference changes everything. Imagine someone who wants financial success. They watch videos about wealth. They read books about prosperity. They dream about having freedom. But deep inside, they still see themselves as someone who struggles. Someone who always has to fight to survive. Someone who must work twice as hard just to reach what others seem to achieve easily. Even if that person wants prosperity, their identity is still aligned with struggle. And identity always wins. Because identity is not just a belief, it is a pattern of perception. It shapes what you notice. It shapes what you ignore. It shapes what feels possible and what feels impossible. For example, two people can see the same opportunity. One person sees possibility. The other sees risk. One person sees growth. The other sees danger. One person sees expansion. The other sees potential loss. The opportunity is the same, but the identity observing it is different, and identity determines action. Someone with a scarcity identity hesitates. They overthink. They wait for certainty. They look for guarantees. They postpone decisions. They say things like, maybe later, maybe when things are more stable, maybe when I feel ready, maybe when I have more money, maybe when the timing is perfect. But certainty never arrives. Because life does not reward hesitation. It rewards alignment, and alignment requires identity. When identity is rooted in survival, every decision becomes defensive. You try to protect what little you have. You avoid risks. You minimize exposure. You choose safety over expansion. And slowly, without realizing it, your world becomes smaller. Your choices become narrower. Your possibilities shrink. Not because the world limited you, but because your identity filtered what you believed was possible. People living in scarcity are not simply lacking money. They are living inside a psychological structure built from comparison, insecurity, and fear. They measure themselves against others. They doubt their own value. They fear making mistakes. They worry about losing what little stability they have built. And so they hesitate. They delay. They second-guess themselves. They play small. This pattern repeats itself in subtle ways. They hesitate when raising their prices. They hesitate when investing in themselves. They hesitate when pursuing bigger opportunities. They hesitate when entering new environments. They hesitate when claiming their value. And each moment of hesitation reinforces the same identity. The identity of someone who is not ready. Someone who is not enough. someone who is still trying to survive. But survival and prosperity operate under completely different rules. Survival is defensive. Prosperity is expansive. Survival asks, how do I avoid losing? Prosperity asks, how do I create more? Survival seeks stability. Prosperity seeks growth. Survival protects. Prosperity builds. And here is where many people become confused. They say they want abundance. They repeat affirmations about wealth. They imagine a life of freedom. But their daily decisions are still rooted in fear. They still think like someone trying to survive. They still move like someone protecting what little they have. And the field responds to that coherence, because the quantum field does not respond to words. It responds to energetic consistency. What repeats becomes reinforced. And over time, repetition becomes identity. The same thoughts repeat. The same fears repeat. The same patterns repeat. And eventually, the person begins to believe something dangerous. They begin to believe that life itself is the problem. They say things like, life is hard, money is difficult, success is rare, opportunities are limited. But what they are actually experiencing is not life. They are experiencing a pattern generated by identity. The quantum identity of scarcity is invisible. You cannot see it directly, but you can observe its effects. It appears in micro-decisions, in the small moments that seem insignificant. Moments like saying, I will think about it later. Maybe this is not the right time. This probably will not work for me. People like me do not usually succeed in things like this. Each of these thoughts seems small, but together they build a structure of self-perception. And that structure quietly shapes your reality. Because every decision you make reinforces who you believe you are. And who you believe you are determines what reality you collapse into existence. And this is where something interesting begins to happen. Once you understand that identity shapes perception, and perception shapes decisions, a new possibility appears. Because if identity can limit your reality, then identity can also expand it. Think about this carefully. Right now, somewhere within the range of possibilities that exist for your life, there is a version of you that has already figured things out. A version of you that no longer feels trapped in cycles of financial stress. A version of you that moves through opportunities with calm instead of fear. A version of you that understands how to create value and how to allow value to flow back. This version of you is not imaginary. It is simply a different alignment. Most people imagine that successful people possess something special. More intelligence, more luck, more connections. But when you observe closely, the real difference often lies in identity. People who prosper do not constantly question whether they deserve prosperity. They do not secretly believe that wealth is something reserved for others. They do not see money as something dangerous, unstable, or impossible to maintain. Instead, they see prosperity as a natural extension of growth. And because they see it that way, their decisions follow that identity. They invest in learning. They step into environments where growth is possible. They take calculated risks. They expose themselves to opportunities that others avoid. Not because they feel no fear, but because their identity is not built around avoiding fear. Their identity is built around expansion, Now, imagine the version of you that already lives from that identity. This version does not constantly replay old stories about limitation. This version does not measure every possibility through the lens of past failures. Instead, this version evaluates reality through the lens of potential. What can be built? What can be learned? What can be expanded? This shift may seem subtle, but in practice it changes everything, because attention begins to move in a different direction. Instead of constantly searching for threats, you begin to recognize possibilities. Instead of protecting a small sense of stability, you begin to build a larger sense of capability. And slowly, something remarkable begins to happen. The world starts responding differently. Not because reality changed overnight, but because your perception of reality expanded. You start noticing opportunities that were always there. You start meeting people who operate at different levels of thinking. You start making decisions that your old identity would never have considered. And each new decision reinforces the emerging identity. The identity that is no longer organized around survival, but around growth. This is what many people misunderstand about prosperity. They believe wealth creates identity. But the deeper truth is that identity creates the conditions where wealth can exist. Money is not the foundation. Identity is, because money amplifies what already exists inside you. If someone carries fear, money amplifies fear. If someone carries confusion, money amplifies confusion. But if someone carries clarity, discipline, and expansion, money amplifies those qualities as well. And this is why so many people experience temporary success. They earn more. They gain more. But without identity transformation, the old patterns remain active. And eventually, those patterns pull reality back to its familiar state. But when identity truly changes, the pattern changes. And when the pattern changes, reality follows. So the real question becomes simple. How do you begin shifting identity? How do you move from an identity organized around survival to an identity organized around prosperity? The answer is not as mysterious as it may seem. It begins with awareness. Most people move through life without ever observing their internal patterns. They react automatically. They think the same thoughts. They repeat the same behaviors. They reinforce the same identity every day without realizing it. But the moment you begin observing your patterns, something changes. You begin to notice the subtle reactions that previously operated in the background. How you respond to opportunity, how you respond to risk, how you respond to the success of others. These reactions reveal the structure of identity. Discomfort is often the first signal. When someone with a survival identity encounters growth, discomfort appears. Growth requires uncertainty. Expansion requires exposure. Prosperity requires responsibility. And the old identity interprets these conditions as threats. But awareness allows you to pause. Instead of reacting automatically, you begin choosing consciously. The second step is interruption. Every identity survives through repetition. The same beliefs, the same interpretations, the same emotional responses. If nothing interrupts that repetition, identity remains stable. But when you begin interrupting those patterns, identity begins to loosen. You question old assumptions. You challenge inherited beliefs. You stop automatically agreeing with the voice that says something is impossible. And gradually, the internal narrative begins to change. The third step is behavioral alignment. Identity is not changed through thought alone. It changes through action. Small actions repeated consistently begin shaping a new internal reference. You invest in your learning even when it feels uncomfortable. You expose yourself to environments where growth is normal. You begin valuing your work differently. You allow yourself to think on a larger scale. Each of these decisions may feel small in isolation, but together they form a new pattern. And patterns eventually become identity. The fourth step is environment. Identity is influenced by the environments we inhabit. If you are surrounded by people who believe scarcity is inevitable, that belief becomes normalized. If you are surrounded by people who constantly expand their capabilities, expansion becomes normal as well. Environment quietly reinforces identity, which is why prosperity often requires changing not only internal beliefs, but also external context. And finally, there is alignment. The quantum field responds to coherence. When thoughts, emotions, and actions begin pointing in the same direction, probability shifts. New opportunities appear. New connections form. New ideas emerge. Not through magic, but through alignment. Perhaps the true quantum leap is not financial. Perhaps it is internal. Perhaps prosperity is not simply the result of earning more. Perhaps it is the result of becoming someone capable of sustaining more. And that brings us back to the question that started this reflection. Are you still acting like the version of yourself that struggles? Or are you ready to step into the identity that allows prosperity to exist naturally? Because the version of you that prospers is not waiting for luck. It is waiting for alignment. And alignment always begins with a decision.